I'm continuing a conversation I began on our broadcast with William Galston, a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution in Washington. Bill, while we're dealing with the situation in Afghanistan, there's also so much debate about the situation in Syria and all the violence there and whether we as the U.S. and the entire international community should intervene. What are the moral factors that we should be using to weigh in on this decision?
Well, it is a humanitarian horror show from one end of Syria to another. It's clear that Bashar Assad is a faithful son of his father, who used similarly brutal tactics to stabilize his regime and prevent it from collapsing in the early 1980s. There is also an internationally recognized duty to protect, which would seem to apply to these cases. But as moral philosophers will tell you, ought implies can. You don't have the duty to act unless you can act effectively to mitigate the harm or to intensify the good. And so the great debate now is not whether we have an abstract moral responsibility. It is obvious that we and the rest of the international community does have such a responsibility, and not just as a moral matter, but also as a matter of recognized international law and custom. But can we deploy our forces effectively? What can we do? One of the problems is that the Syrian opposition is not unified. Another problem is that it's not in one part of the country the way the revolution began in Libya. If we wanted to establish a safe haven, what would we do? If we wanted to establish a humanitarian corridor, how would we do it? And so I think the Secretary of Defense was entirely right to push back against senators in a recent hearing who were urging him to go all in Syria. And Panetta said, well, what's the mission? Can we do it? And are we sure that we'll do more good than harm if we try? Those are the right questions, not just from a military standpoint, but it seems to me from a moral standpoint as well.
And those questions are straight from the just war tradition, which has set up that criteria. I mean, talk a little more about what some of those just war principles would have us do in Syria.
Well, first of all, the cause must be just. And I think it pretty clearly is in this case, although it's not a classic just war defensive rationale. The rationale of just military action has been broadened by the United States, and I think by changing international norms. Then, of course, the force that you use must be proportionate. And so if we had to kill thousands and thousands and thousands of people in the Syrian army, then I think some questions would begin to arise as to whether we hadn't overreached, morally speaking. And there must be a reasonable probability of success. Nothing is certain in human affairs. Everybody knows that, and that's been established all the way back to Aristotle, who said that we don't deliberate about things that we know for certain one way or the other. Deliberation is and judgment, political decision, and action are always within a framework of uncertainty as to the outcome. And it seems to me that unless and until we get clearer about the mode of intervention, we won't be able to make a very clear, compelling judgment as to the likelihood of its success. I do think that we could probably do something that was proportionate to assist the trickle, now a swelling trickle, of civilians caught in the crossfire who want to cross the Syrian border into Turkey or other adjoining countries. If they're willing, because we can't do it without their cooperation, and if there's a plan to do it, then at the very least, allowing civilians who want to escape to flee into a safer zone or safer zones, I think would be entirely justified, once again, assuming that the preconditions for success are met.
And how is this different from Libya? You mentioned Libya a little earlier, but it seemed like there people were more willing to exercise this duty to protect.
If there hadn't been geographical clarity in Libya, I think it would have been more difficult. the fact that in some ways this was a renewal of an ancient quarrel between the eastern province of Libya and the western province, so that there was a there, and assisting the rebels meant, in the first instance, preventing their strongholds in the east from being overrun by Gaddafi's forces pouring in along that northern highway from the west. That made the calculus somewhat easier. What is so difficult about Syria is the extraordinary interpenetration of Assad's forces and the somewhat ragtag and disorganized rebel forces, and I think it's fair to call them rebel forces at this point. This is not just a civilian resistance. This has all the trappings now of a civil war that is on many, many fronts simultaneously. There's no organized Syrian rebel army the way there was in Libya, although the degree of its organization was in doubt for many weeks or even months. So we have a really, really tough job. I mean, it's like separating flesh and blood. How do you do it? But if there is a clear plan that the United States and its allies can get behind that seriously addresses these sorts of practical questions that have moral ripple effects through the entire just war tradition, then I certainly would not be opposed to action.
All right, Bill Galston, thank you very much.
My pleasure.